All right, welcome to another deep dive. Looks like you guys really outdid yourselves this time.
Yeah, there's a lot to get through.
A lot to get through. We've got excerpts from a Brazilian political commentary video, some breaking news from Reuters, and even an analysis of modern drone warfare.
Wow.
All centered around the Russia-Ukraine conflict, so really kind of focusing on the global power dynamics at play.
Yeah.
It's fascinating stuff, so let's just jump right in. Trump recently made statements about getting a letter from Zelensky, expressing a willingness to negotiate with Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And on the surface, that sounds like a positive step, but I can't help but wonder about the timing.
Yeah, it comes after some tension between the U.S. and Ukraine.
Right.
Trump temporarily suspended military aid to Ukraine.
Right.
And there have been these kind of persistent rumors about a possible mineral deal between Trump and Zelensky.
Oh, yeah, that mysterious mineral deal.
Right.
Some reports say it exists, others deny it, and nobody seems to know what it's really about. It's like a political enigma wrapped in a riddle.
Exactly.
So how do we even begin to decipher what Trump's true intentions are?
Well, I think to understand this, we need to look at the concept of realpolitik.
Realpolitik. I've heard the term, but could you remind me what that means exactly?
Essentially, realpolitik is it's a political philosophy that prioritizes practical considerations and national self-interest, over ethical concerns or ideological principles.
Okay.
It's about pursuing power and achieving kind of concrete objectives, often through pragmatic and sometimes even ruthless means.
So essentially it's saying that Trump's putting America's interests first, even if it means potentially sacrificing Ukraine's well-being.
Yeah, it's a cynical interpretation,
right,
but it's one that some analysts are putting forward. They argue that Trump sees this conflict as just, primarily through the lens of U.S. interests, and his actions are calculated to maximize American gains, regardless of the impact on Ukraine.
That's a pretty sobering thought.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because Zelensky's kind of caught in the middle of all this, right? He seems to be navigating a difficult path, trying to maintain U.S. support while also exploring options for negotiation.
Yeah, he's in a very tricky position,
right,
especially considering his 2022 decree prohibiting direct talks with Putin.
Ah, right.
So that decree creates a significant obstacle to any real progress toward negotiations.
Right. It makes you wonder how much room Zelensky actually has to maneuver.
Yeah.
I mean, is he truly open to compromise? Or is this just a tactic to buy time and appease both sides?
It's hard to say for sure, but one thing is clear.
Okay.
Zelensky's kind of caught between a rock and a hard place, trying to balance this, the need for peace with the need to preserve Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. It's tough.
And speaking of maneuvering, Russia's response to this whole peace overture has been rather lukewarm, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, definitely. The Kremlin has been very cautious, almost dismissive. Remember that quote from Peskov, Putin's spokesperson? With whom exactly could Russia negotiate?
Yeah, it's almost like they're saying, we're not convinced you're serious, and even if you were, are you even talking to the right people?
Yeah.
So it doesn't exactly inspire confidence in the prospects for a settlement.
No.
And then just to add to that, we have this news that the U.S. has decided to suspend intelligence sharing with Ukraine. CIA Director John Ratcliffe actually confirmed it.
Wow.
And it's really kind of raising eyebrows, all over the place. Can you help unpack that a little bit? I mean, the U.S. is cutting off intelligence to Ukraine.
Yeah, so U.S. intelligence has played a really big role in Ukraine's defense against Russia.
Okay.
They've relied heavily on U.S. intel to anticipate Russian moves, plan their defenses, and even target their attacks.
I see.
So cutting off this flow of information could significantly hamper their ability to, resist Russian aggression.
I mean, it seems like a risky move. Why would the U.S. do that?
Well, Ratcliffe hinted that cooperation could resume if peace negotiations make progress. So it suggests that the U.S. might be using this intelligence suspension as leverage to pressure Zelensky into, coming to the negotiating table.
Ah, okay. So it's kind of a pressure tactic then.
Right.
To force Zelensky's hand. It makes sense from a realpolitik perspective, but it still feels like a gamble.
Yeah.
And a pretty big one.
It is a gamble, yeah, and it could backfire spectacularly.
Right.
Cutting off intelligence could weaken Ukraine's defenses, making them more vulnerable to Russian advances. And if negotiations fail, the U.S. risks permanently damaging its relationship with Ukraine.
So it's a really delicate balancing act.
Yeah.
And it seems like this situation is even more complicated because the U.S. might also be trying to use this leverage to address other geopolitical concerns, specifically Iran's nuclear program.
Right.
Now, how does Iran fit into this?
Well, according to the Kremlin, the issue of Iran's nuclear program is going to be a key topic in future U.S.-Russia talks.
Okay.
It was even discussed, at least briefly, during those recent negotiations in Saudi Arabia.
So is Russia trying to position itself as a mediator between the U.S. and Iran?
Potentially.
That's a pretty bold move.
It is a bold move, yeah, and it speaks to Russia's growing strategic alliance with Iran.
Okay.
They signed a cooperation treaty earlier this year, cementing their partnership. And it gives Russia more leverage in negotiations with the U.S.
I see. So Russia could potentially use this leverage to get concessions from the U.S., maybe offer concessions on Ukraine in exchange for advantages related to Iran's nuclear program.
Oh, exactly. It's a classic geopolitical chess game.
Right.
With each side trying to use its pawns to gain an advantage on the board.
But the thing is, the U.S. has been pursuing this maximum pressure strategy against Iran, essentially trying to cripple their economy.
Right.
And that seems kind of at odds with Russia's more diplomatic approach.
It does, and this divergence in strategies could lead to a deadlock.
Right.
Or even worse, an escalation of tensions.
Right. It's a delicate situation, for sure.
Yeah.
So we've got these peace talks that are barely limping along. We've got this mysterious mineral deal that no one seems to understand.
Right.
We've got the U.S. playing hardball with intelligence sharing, and now we're throwing Iran into the mix. It's a geopolitical puzzle with a lot of missing pieces.
It is.
And to make matters even more complicated, there's another factor we need to consider. One that's changing the very nature of warfare and challenging the balance of power on a global scale.
Oh, wow.
We're talking about drone warfare.
Drone warfare. All right.
Yeah.
Okay,
drone warfare. I have to admit, when I first started reading about this, it felt like something out of a science fiction film.
Yeah.
But it's all too real, isn't it?
It is. And it's evolving at an alarming pace. The Ukraine conflict has really given us a glimpse into the future of warfare. A future where battles are fought not just by soldiers on the ground, but by these unmanned aerial vehicles controlled remotely, often from thousands of miles away.
Yeah, and we've heard some pretty stark warnings from those on the front lines. Colonel Vadim Sukharevsky, commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, has said NATO just isn't ready for this type of warfare.
Yeah.
So his assessment is kind of a wake-up call, isn't it?
It is, for the West. Yeah, he's essentially saying that the traditional military doctrines, the ones that rely on conventional weapons, large-scale ground operations, are becoming obsolete in the face of this new technological reality.
So what makes drone warfare so different?
Well, several things. First, there's the element of asymmetry.
Okay.
Drone technology is becoming increasingly affordable, increasingly accessible.
Right.
Meaning even smaller nations or non-state actors can field significant drone forces.
Right.
So it's leveling the playing field, allowing them to, challenge larger, more powerful adversaries in ways that were previously unimaginable.
So it's no longer about who has the biggest army or the most advanced weapon systems. It's about who can adapt to this new form of warfare.
Yeah, and then there's the psychological impact, Drone warfare creates a sense of constant surveillance, constant threat, knowing that an enemy drone could strike at any moment from anywhere.
Right.
And this can demoralize troops and really disrupt traditional battlefield tactics.
And I imagine it also raises a lot of ethical questions too, right?
Of course.
Taking human soldiers out of the direct line of fire. I mean, that might seem like a good thing, but doesn't it also make it easier to wage war, to dehumanize the enemy, to distance ourselves from the consequences of our actions?
Absolutely. The use of drones raises all sorts of profound ethical and legal dilemmas that, we're only beginning to grapple with as a global community. Questions about accountability, proportionality, the potential for unintended civilian casualties, all front and center.
And then there's the sheer scale of drone deployment in Ukraine. We're talking about millions of drones being produced.
Yeah.
That's a staggering number.
It's a huge number, and it really highlights the rapid proliferation of this technology. Drone production is no longer limited to a handful of advanced nations.
Right.
Countries all over the world are developing and manufacturing their own drones, and that has, profound implications for global security.
And the tactics being developed are just evolving so quickly. We're seeing things like laser weapons being used to down drones.
Right.
And even mothership drones that can launch swarms of smaller attack drones far behind enemy lines.
Yeah. Yeah, it's this constant game of cat and mouse, right? With each side trying to outmaneuver the other.
Right.
And the battlefield is no longer confined to a specific, geographic location.
Yeah.
Drone warfare blurs the lines between front lines and civilian areas, making it harder to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants.
So what does this all mean for the future of warfare?
Well,
is this the end of traditional armies as we know them?
I mean, it's unlikely that traditional armies will completely disappear.
Okay.
But their role is definitely evolving.
Yeah.
We're probably going to see a shift towards hybrid warfare, where conventional forces operate alongside these unmanned systems, cyber warfare capabilities, sophisticated information operations.
So it sounds like we're really entering a new era of conflict here.
We are.
Where the rules are still being written and the stakes are incredibly high.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about these peace talks. We've talked about all the political maneuvering, intelligence fallout, the rise of drone warfare. I have to imagine that our listeners might be feeling a bit overwhelmed at this point.
Yeah, it's a lot to digest.
It's a lot. But amidst all of this, there's another layer to this story.
Yeah.
One that challenges the very frameworks we use to understand global politics. You're referring to that Brazilian political commentary video we mentioned earlier.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The one that critiques the whole left-right paradigm.
Yeah, so the professor in that video argues that those traditional left-right labels are just no longer adequate for understanding the complexities of the modern world, particularly when it comes to geopolitics.
Right. Yeah.
He says it's a much more nuanced game, driven by this, complex web of national interests, strategic calculations, and historical baggage.
And he specifically takes issue with a Reuters article that tries to portray the clash between Trump and Zelensky as this simple division between the left and the right in Europe.
Right. He argues that reducing these, complex geopolitical maneuvers to a simplistic left versus right battle just ignores the real motivations at play. It's not about ideology.
Right.
It's about power, influence, and self-preservation.
So if the traditional left-right framework is no longer sufficient, what other lens can we use to understand what's happening in Ukraine and, in the world more broadly?
Well, one lens we can use is that concept of strategic self-interest, which we touched upon earlier, when discussing Trump's approach to the conflict.
Right. The idea that nations, like individuals, tend to act in ways that benefit them.
Exactly, yeah.
Regardless of ethical or ideological considerations.
Precisely. And this applies not just to the U.S., but to all the actors involved.
Right.
Russia, Ukraine, and even countries that aren't directly involved, like China.
So how does the lens of strategic self-interest help us understand, say, Russia's actions in Ukraine?
Well, from Russia's perspective, they see Ukraine as this crucial buffer zone between themselves and NATO. They've repeatedly expressed concerns about NATO expansion eastward, viewing it as a direct threat to their security.
But NATO maintains that its expansion is purely defensive, aimed at protecting its members from aggression.
And that's where the concept of the security dilemma comes in.
The security dilemma.
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with that term.
So it's a situation in international relations where one state's actions to increase its own security are perceived as a threat by another state, which leads to a spiral of mistrust and escalation. Both sides feel insecure.
Right.
Both sides take steps to kind of bolster their defenses, and those steps are then interpreted as hostile by the other side, further increasing tensions.
So it's kind of a vicious cycle.
Exactly.
Each side's attempts to protect itself actually make the situation more dangerous.
Yeah, and this dynamic is definitely at play
Right.
in the relationship between Russia and NATO. Russia sees NATO expansion as a threat. NATO sees Russian military buildup as a threat. And both sides take actions that further reinforce the other's fears.
It's a classic catch-22, a no-win situation.
Unfortunately, yeah, and the security dilemma is one of the, key factors that has led to this current crisis in Ukraine.
So if we're looking at this through the lens of strategic self-interest, what about Ukraine's motivations? What are their interests in all of this?
Well, for Ukraine, it's about survival.
Okay.
About maintaining their independence and territorial integrity in the face of Russian aggression. They want to determine their own destiny, to choose their own alliances, and to build, a democratic and prosperous society free from Russian interference.
And they've certainly demonstrated a determination to resist.
They have.
I mean, the world has been amazed by their resilience.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that Ukraine's not a monolithic entity.
Right.
Right.
Right. There are different perspectives within Ukraine about how to best move forward.
Okay.
About how to balance their relationship with Russia and the West.
No.
And about what a, peaceful resolution might even look like.
So it's not as simple as just saying Ukraine wants this or Russia wants that. There's a lot of internal complexity on both sides.
There is, yeah. And to really understand this conflict, we need to delve into those complexities to understand the different, actors and interests at play, both within and between nations.
We've talked about the U.S. and Russia, but what about other countries like China?
Yeah.
Where do they fit into this whole equation of strategic self-interest?
Well, China's a fascinating case study.
Yeah.
They've been relatively quiet throughout this whole conflict, but they're definitely watching it closely.
Right.
Analyzing the dynamics of power, the implications for their own global ambitions.
So they're playing the long game here.
Yeah, I think so.
Kind of observing and waiting for the right moment to make their move.
In a sense, yeah.
Because they have a complex relationship with both Russia and the West, right?
Right, yeah. They have these very strong economic ties with Russia.
Right.
But they're also wary of alienating the West.
Right.
Which remains a crucial trading partner.
So they're walking a tightrope.
They are.
Trying to maintain these good relations with both sides.
Exactly.
And I imagine they're calculating how the outcome of this conflict might affect their own ambitions, particularly, in the Indo-Pacific region.
Yeah.
It's almost like they're trying to have their cake and eat it too.
In a way, yeah. They're trying to maximize their own gains while minimizing their risks.
Right.
And they're not the only ones.
Okay.
Many countries are adopting this kind of approach.
Right.
Hedging their bets and waiting to see how the situation unfolds before committing to a particular, course of action.
So strategic self-interest is one lens we can use to understand the motivations of these different actors. But you mentioned earlier that historical baggage also plays a role.
Right.
What did you mean by that?
Well, nations, like individuals, are shaped by their past experiences. Their history informs their perceptions of the present and influences their decisions about the future.
So to understand a nation's actions today, we have to understand their history.
Precisely. For example, Russia's historical experience of invasion and encirclement by hostile powers, has profoundly shaped their worldview.
Right.
They see themselves as constantly under threat, constantly surrounded by enemies.
So their actions in Ukraine, from their perspective, are about protecting themselves from a perceived threat.
Yeah, that's a significant part of their narrative.
Okay.
They draw on centuries of historical memory to justify their actions, to portray themselves as, the victims rather than the aggressors.
Right.
They evoke memories of past invasions, of sacrifices made to defend their homeland, to mobilize their people and rally support for their cause.
But isn't there a danger in relying too heavily on historical narratives?
There is.
Can't that lead to a perpetuation of grievances?
It can, yeah.
To a cycle of mistrust and hostility that makes it even harder to find any kind of common ground?
There's definitely a risk of that. Historical narratives can be powerful tools, but they can also be manipulated and distorted to serve political agendas.
Right.
It's really important to be critical of historical narratives.
Right.
To examine them from multiple perspectives and to recognize that history is often a matter of interpretation.
Period.
Not just a collection of, objective facts.
So it's about recognizing the power of historical memory while also being aware of its limitations.
Right.
Its potential to be used as a weapon.
Exactly.
To justify aggression, to demonize the other.
We need to understand how historical narratives shape our perceptions and influence our actions, both for good and for bad. We need to be willing to challenge our own historical narratives, to confront uncomfortable truths, and to acknowledge the ways in which our own nation's actions may have contributed to the current state of affairs.
It's a call for greater self-awareness.
It is.
For a more nuanced and critical understanding of history.
Yeah.
And a willingness to engage with the past in a way that promotes, understanding and reconciliation.
Exactly.
Rather than perpetuating division and conflict.
And this applies not just to Russia and Ukraine, but to all nations. We all carry historical baggage, and we need to be mindful of how that baggage shapes our interactions with others.
Right.
We need to be willing to acknowledge past wrongs, to learn from our mistakes, and to, build relationships based on mutual respect and understanding, even if we disagree about the past.
It's a tall order.
It is, yeah.
But it seems essential if we want to break free from these cycles of conflict and build a more peaceful and just world.
It starts with, recognizing our shared humanity despite our differences.
Yeah.
And a commitment to dialogue, to empathy, and to the pursuit of truth, even when it's uncomfortable.
So far, we've talked about strategic self-interest, historical baggage as key losses for understanding this conflict. Mm-hmm. But there's another powerful force shaping the world today, something that's transforming societies, economies, and even the nature of warfare itself.
You're talking about technology.
Exactly. We've already touched upon the impact of drone technology on warfare, but the influence of technology goes so far beyond the battlefield.
Right.
It's reshaping the global landscape in really profound ways.
Absolutely. And one of the most significant technological developments in recent years is the rise of artificial intelligence, or AI.
AI, it's a term we hear a lot these days, but it can still feel a bit abstract.
Yeah.
Can you kind of explain what AI is and why it's so significant?
Sure. So, in essence, AI refers to the ability of machines to perform tasks that typically require, human intelligence, such as learning, problem-solving, decision-making.
Right.
It's about creating computer systems that can think and act like humans, or even, surpass human capabilities in certain areas.
And how is this impacting the world beyond, the obvious applications and things like self-driving cars and virtual assistants?
Well, AI is having a huge impact on virtually every aspect of our lives.
Yeah.
From the way we work and communicate to the way we govern and wage war. It's automating jobs, creating new industries, transforming the global economy.
Wow.
It's also giving nations with these advanced AI capabilities a huge advantage in areas like military intelligence, cyber warfare, and even the development of autonomous weapon systems.
Autonomous weapon systems. You mean weapons that can make decisions and take actions without human intervention?
Precisely.
And is that actually happening now?
Yeah, it is. And it's raising all sorts of these, profound ethical and legal questions about the future of warfare. Who's responsible if an AI-powered weapon system malfunctions and causes, civilian casualties? How do we ensure that these systems are used ethically and responsibly?
Yeah, right.
These are questions that we need to answer urgently, before it's too late.
It's a chilling thought, and it really highlights the need for, greater international cooperation and regulation.
Oh, absolutely.
In the development and deployment of AI. It's a powerful tool, but it's a tool that needs to be wielded with caution and wisdom.
It does, yeah.
We need to make sure that AI is used for good, that it benefits all of humanity, not just the select few. So AI is one aspect of this technological revolution. What are some other technological trends that we should be paying attention to?
Well, another major trend is the increasing interconnectedness of the world, driven by advances in, communications technology, particularly the internet and social media.
Right.
And this interconnectedness has created, unprecedented opportunities for communication, collaboration, and knowledge sharing. But it's also created new vulnerabilities, new avenues for conflict, and new challenges for, global governance.
You're talking about things like cyber warfare?
Exactly.
The spread of misinformation, erosion of privacy.
All of that. Yeah, the digital realm has become a new battleground where nations and non-state actors alike are vying for influence, spreading propaganda, launching cyber attacks against their adversaries. And the lines between the physical and digital worlds are really blurring, with cyber attacks increasingly having real-world consequences.
Right.
From, disrupting critical infrastructure to manipulating elections.
It really sounds like the world is becoming increasingly complex.
It is.
And unpredictable.
It is, yeah.
With technology acting as both a catalyst for change and a source of new threats.
Exactly.
And to navigate all of this requires new ways of thinking, new approaches to governance, and a willingness to adapt and evolve.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked about strategic self-interest, historical baggage, and technology as key forces that are shaping the world today. But there's one final factor we need to consider.
What?
One that's arguably more powerful than any of the others.
And that is information.
Information, right.
The information age.
The information age.
A double-edged sword, wouldn't you say?
To be sure, yeah.
It's given us this unprecedented access to information.
Yeah.
But it's also made it so much easier to spread misinformation, propaganda, and hate speech.
Absolutely.
And we've really seen how this weaponization of information can be used to just sow division, manipulate public opinion,
Absolutely.
and to justify aggression.
Right. Yeah, the battle for hearts and minds is as fierce as ever, perhaps even more so in this digital age.
Right.
And the lines between truth and falsehood are increasingly blurred.
So how do we even begin to navigate this treacherous information landscape? How do we distinguish fact from fiction?
It's more important now than ever to develop critical thinking skills, to be skeptical of information sources, and to cross-check information before we share it. We need to be aware of our own biases.
And to seek out diverse perspectives.
So it's almost like we all need to become amateur detectives.
In a way,
Constantly scrutinizing the information we encounter, looking for clues to determine whether it's true or not.
Yeah, we need to be vigilant, to question everything, and to, be wary of easy answers.
Right.
The truth is often very complex and nuanced.
Right.
And it takes effort to uncover it.
So how do we make sure that the truth gets heard?
It's a challenging task.
How do we combat the spread of all this misinformation and propaganda?
It is a challenging task, but there are things we can do.
Okay.
We can support independent journalism, promote media literacy, and hold social media platforms accountable for the content they host.
Okay.
We can also engage in, constructive dialogue, challenge misinformation when we see it, and amplify credible sources of information.
So it sounds like this is a collective effort.
It is.
It's something that we all need to be involved in.
We all have a role to play.
Right. In safeguarding the integrity of information, promoting truth and accountability, and creating a more, informed and engaged citizenry. We can't afford to be passive consumers of information.
Right.
We need to be active participants in the shaping of our, shared reality.
It's a call to action.
It is.
It's a call to become more discerning consumers of information.
Yeah.
To hold those in power accountable and to engage in constructive dialogue.
Right.
That promotes understanding, that bridges divides.
Exactly. The future of our democracies and indeed the future of our planet depends on it.
All right. So we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah.
From the specific dynamics of this Russia-Ukraine conflict to the broader challenges facing the world in the 21st century.
Right.
We've talked about strategic self-interest, historical baggage, technology, information, these key factors that are shaping the global landscape.
Yeah.
But where does that leave us? What are the key takeaways here? I think one of the key takeaways is that the world is becoming increasingly complex and interconnected.
Okay.
The old rules of engagement are breaking down. Traditional power structures are being challenged.
So it's a world in flux, a world in transition.
Precisely.
And that creates both opportunities and risks.
It does.
On the one hand, it opens up possibilities for, new forms of cooperation, for addressing these global challenges collaboratively, for building a more just and sustainable world order.
Exactly.
But on the other hand, it also increases the potential for conflict, for misunderstanding, for unintended consequences.
Absolutely.
So events in one region can have ripple effects across the globe.
They can, yeah.
A conflict in one region can quickly escalate into a global crisis.
Right.
The spread of misinformation and propaganda can really sow division and distrust, undermine the foundations of peace and stability.
Yeah, it can.
It sounds like a very daunting and uncertain future.
It can feel that way. But it's important to remember that we're not just, passive observers of this unfolding drama.
Okay.
We're active participants. And we have the power to shape the future, both through our individual choices and through our, collective actions.
So what can we do as individuals to navigate all of this?
Right.
How can we make a difference? How can we promote peace and understanding?
Well, I think the first step is to educate ourselves.
Okay.
To stay informed about, global events.
Right.
To understand the different, perspectives and motivations at play. We need to be, critical thinkers.
Right.
To question the information we receive, to seek out, diverse sources of knowledge.
So it's about becoming more informed and engaged citizens.
Exactly.
About taking responsibility for our own understanding of the world.
Right.
And it's about finding ways to connect with people from different cultures to build bridges of understanding and empathy.
We need to, break out of our echo chambers. Right. to challenge our own biases, to see the world through the eyes of others.
It's a call for greater compassion.
It is.
For greater humanity.
Yeah.
In our approach to global affairs.
We need to recognize that we're all part of, the same human family.
Right.
That we share a common destiny. We need to find ways to work together.
Right.
To create a future where, everyone can thrive, where peace and justice prevail.
It's a lofty goal, but one worth striving for.
Absolutely. And it starts with, each of us.
Right.
With the choices we make every day, with the way we interact with each other, with the way we engage with the world around us.
It's a message of hope. A reminder that even in the face of all these challenges, we have the agency to shape our own future.
Yeah.
To create a world that reflects our values and our aspirations.
Yeah.
But it's also a call to action.
It is.
A challenge to step out of our comfort zones, to engage with the world in a more meaningful way.
Absolutely.
And to contribute to the collective effort to build a better future.
Precisely. We can't afford to be complacent or indifferent. The stakes are too high.
Right.
We need to be informed, engaged, and active participants in shaping the world we want to live in.
Well said. All right, we've covered so much in this deep dive.
Yeah.
As we wrap up this part of our conversation, I can't help but wonder, what's next? What are the potential scenarios that might unfold in Ukraine, and what are the implications for the global order?
That's the, million-dollar question.
Right.
And unfortunately, there's no crystal ball. But, what we can do is analyze the current trends, the motivations of the, key players, and the historical patterns that have shaped this conflict to develop, a range of possible scenarios.
So let's put on our prognosticator hats and explore some of those scenarios.
Okay.
What are the potential pathways forward, and what are the implications for Ukraine, for Russia, and for the world?
All right, let's do it. Okay, so we've laid out a lot of the complexities surrounding this conflict, but where do we go from here? What are some of the potential outcomes of this whole situation, and how could they impact the global landscape?
Well, one scenario that's often discussed is a negotiated settlement, a diplomatic solution that brings an end to the fighting and establishes some kind of framework for peaceful coexistence between Ukraine and Russia.
That sounds like the ideal outcome, but how realistic is it given the current level of mistrust and the deep divisions between the two sides?
It's certainly a challenging path. It's not easy, but it's not impossible. A negotiated settlement would likely involve a combination of concessions and compromises from both sides.
What kind of concessions are we talking about? I mean, would Ukraine be willing to cede territory or accept, limitations on its sovereignty?
That's a tough question, and one that, only the Ukrainians can answer. But a realistic settlement might involve some form of territorial compromise, perhaps granting some level of autonomy to the disputed regions in eastern Ukraine.
And what about Russia? What would they need to concede to reach a deal?
Well, for Russia, a key demand would likely be security guarantees from NATO, assurances that Ukraine will not join the alliance, and that NATO forces will not be deployed on Ukrainian soil. They might also seek the lifting of some of the economic sanctions that have been imposed on them, since the start of the conflict.
So it would require a lot of give and take from both sides and a willingness to, accept less than their ideal outcome. But even if they could reach a deal on paper, how do you ensure that it's actually implemented and that the fighting doesn't, flare up again in a few months or years?
Right. That's the challenge with any peace agreement, right? Enforcement and implementation. A lasting settlement would likely require some form of international peacekeeping force to monitor the ceasefire lines and prevent further violence. It would also require, a commitment from both sides to address those underlying grievances that fueled the conflict in the first place.
It sounds like a monumental task, one that would require a huge amount of goodwill, trust, and international support. But let's say for a moment that a negotiated settlement just isn't possible. What other scenarios might we see play out?
Well, another possibility is a protracted conflict, a stalemate, where neither side is able to achieve a decisive victory, and the fighting just drags on for years, potentially even decades.
A frozen conflict like we've seen in other parts of the former Soviet Union.
Exactly, yeah. And this scenario would be devastating for Ukraine, continuing to inflict suffering on its people and further damaging its economy and infrastructure. It would also be a drain on Russia's resources and a source of international tension and instability.
And it wouldn't necessarily bring stability to the region either, would it? A frozen conflict could easily reignite, especially if there are, external powers kind of stoking the flames.
You're absolutely right. A frozen conflict is rarely truly frozen. It's more like a smoldering ember that can easily, burst back into flames with the slightest provocation.
Okay, so we've got a negotiated settlement on one end of the spectrum and a protracted conflict on the other. Are there any other potential scenarios that fall somewhere in between?
There are. One possibility is a scenario where Russia achieves a limited victory, perhaps consolidating its control over the disputed territories in eastern Ukraine, but stopping short of, a full-scale invasion and occupation of the entire country.
So a partial victory for Russia, but a significant loss for Ukraine nonetheless.
Exactly. And this outcome would likely lead to, a new Cold War-style standoff between Russia and the West, with increased tensions, military buildups, and a, heightened risk of miscalculation and escalation.
And what about the scenario where Ukraine actually manages to repel the Russian invasion and push them back, beyond their own borders? Is that even a possibility?
It's certainly a less likely scenario, given the current balance of power. But it's not entirely out of the realm of possibility. If Ukraine can continue to receive significant military and economic support from the West, and if Russia's military campaign continues to, falter, it's conceivable that Ukraine could eventually gain the upper hand.
Wow, that would be a huge turning point, not just for Ukraine, but for the entire global order. But what would the consequences be? Would Russia simply accept defeat, or would they, escalate the conflict even further?
Right, and that's the danger with this scenario. A humiliated and cornered Russia could become even more unpredictable and dangerous. They might lash out at neighboring countries or, resort to even more desperate measures to regain their lost prestige and influence.
So it's a double-edged sword. A Ukrainian victory could potentially lead to, a more stable and democratic Europe, but it could also trigger a whole new set of challenges and risks.
Exactly. And this just highlights the interconnectedness of the modern world. Events in one region can have far-reaching consequences across the globe, and the decisions made by leaders in Moscow, Kyiv, Washington, and other capitals, will shape not just the future of Ukraine, but the future of the entire international system.
It's a sobering thought for sure, and a reminder that we're living in a time of, profound change and uncertainty. The old certainties are crumbling and the future is up for grabs. But as we've discussed throughout this deep dive, it's not just about, understanding the world as it is. It's about envisioning the world we want to create and taking action to make that vision a reality.
Well said. We may not be able to predict the future with certainty, but we can choose to be active participants in shaping it. By engaging in these deep dives, by asking tough questions, by challenging our own assumptions, and by seeking out diverse perspectives, we can start to make sense of the chaos and find our own path forward.
It's been a fascinating and thought-provoking conversation. Thanks so much for joining me and for sharing your insights.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it informative and engaging. And remember, the journey of understanding doesn't end here. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep striving for a better world. That's it for this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.